This is Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. And on the gist today, we're looking at the essence of foreign troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and what it means for Pakistan's sponsoring of state terror. Welcome to Dr. Michael Rubin. He's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for giving us time on Strat News Global. Dr. Rubin, good morning to you. It's late in the evening here.
And good evening to you. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Rubin, when we're talking about your recent writings, and that's why we've got you as the host to explore your ideas on how possibly down the road the exit of troops could possibly give America the freedom to take action against Pakistan, which has been the hub of terrorism in the region for so many years, which everybody knows, but action wasn't taken precisely because of the fact that there will be no US troops, there will be no foreign troops, logistic lines will not be affected. Could you elaborate on that thought of yours, Dr. Rubin?
Well, you're absolutely right. The reason why Pakistan, in essence, got a get-out-of-jail-free card, the reason why it was able to act with impunity was simply because the United States had needed it for the logistical supply into Afghanistan. As the United States completely withdraws from Afghanistan, we no longer need Pakistan. Now, the Pakistani armed forces, specifically the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, is crowing triumphant that somehow they have defeated the United States. But if you look at the pattern of history, whenever the United States doesn't need Pakistan, whenever we don't need them for whatever reason, that's when the United States imposes sanctions on Pakistan. And I would expect that we're entering that phase again. Pakistan may not realize it, but they may soon face some significant terror-related sanctions.
Well, when we look at the recent past, now May 2nd, of course, the 10th anniversary of the taking out of Osama bin Laden and Abbottabad by the SEAL Force 6. The Taliban in late April were also eulogizing Mullah Omar. His death 8 years ago, it was announced, of course, 2 years after he died. That was in Pakistan. His successor, Mullah Mansour, was killed in an airstrike in Balochistan in Pakistan. There were reports earlier which were denied, but we still don't have proof of life of Akhundzada as well, the current Taliban head. So everything is in Pakistan. Everybody knows that. It's not, especially now, President Biden, right?
Absolutely. President Biden, there has been no U.S. president who has come into office with such experience when it comes to foreign policy and defense than President Biden. The runner-up, I would guess, would be George H.W. Bush, who, of course, was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency at one point. But the fact of the matter is, while the Pakistanis oftentimes put on the charm offensive whenever any new president enters the Oval Office, in many ways, whether you like Biden or dislike Biden, he's immune from this. He's been there, he's seen that, and the Pakistanis aren't going to be able to charm him. He's very well aware of the reality of Pakistan and the reality of Pakistani terror support.
He was in the sit room when the Abbottabad raid was going on. We saw all those pictures, of course. Before Vice President, he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as well. But just looking at the previous administration and how there was a change there. 2018, I think it was January, when then President Trump announced his new South Asia policy, again, as was his wont, calling out Pakistan directly on Twitter. But subsequently, things changed. Was it only because troops were there in Afghanistan?
To some extent, yes, that's a major factor. But if we want to look at the broader sweep of history, when the United States has sanctioned Pakistan previously with regard to its nuclear work, for example, with the Symington Amendment, with the Glenn Amendment, the Pressler Amendment, and so forth, one of the constraints on how far the United States could go with those sanctions is we hadn't fully developed our relations with India. Certainly when it comes to the United States-India relationship, we still have a way to go. We still have real obstacles and impediments to overcome, but there's an exponential difference between the warmth of the American-India partnership and it truly is a partnership vis-a-vis the way the United States feels towards Pakistan at this point. And therefore, given the development of U.S.-Indian relations, given the common threats from China as well, it really does lead to the sense that the United States is going to be much more willing to take action against Pakistan, especially as Pakistan more or less becomes a colony of China.
Ruben, when you talk about Pakistan having a free get out of jail pass so far and things may change, you also mentioned that Pakistan possibly hasn't realized that as yet because of it's beating its own drum of defeating a second superpower in the region after the Soviets, now the Americans.
Yeah.
Do you see America having realized what will have to be done with Pakistan, or is that something down the road?
That's something a little bit down the road. I mean, what's going to happen with the United States, we have a tremendous capacity to believe our own spin. And in the heat of a political debate, and America is very polarized right now, many in the press are going to, in the American press, are going to repeat the spin that comes from President Biden, from his National Security Council, and so forth. But the fact of the matter is as this moves forward, the United States doesn't like to blame itself. And while we are enabling a tragedy with our withdrawal, the fact of the matter is, for example, the vast majority of the explosives which the Taliban use in their terrorist bombing come from one of two different fertilizer plants inside Pakistan. So the fingerprints on any terror is going to be on Pakistan. If the Taliban make inroads, if they massacre girls at a high school, if they move into Kabul and they flog women, there's going to be tremendous pressure back in the United States to take some action. And the natural action in this case would actually be a terror designation. Pakistan doesn't really have any supporters in the Congress anymore who would act as an impediment on this, nor would the so-called realists say, well, we can't do this. We have to kick the can down the road because we need Pakistan. The fact of the matter is, we no longer do.
No longer do. You were talking about, say, an attack on a girls' school or women being flogged in Kabul while these negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban were on, and they stalled. Even those are stalled at the moment. Attacks against Afghans were continuing and were increasing, whether it's the Afghan National Security Forces, whether it was Afghan journalists or targeted individuals or groups. What is the trigger that will make America react against Pakistan?
Well, ultimately, it would just be an atrocity which is so, which stands apart from the atrocities which we see on a day-to-day basis, an atrocity which gets picked up by the press. And unfortunately, the Americans don't have many press there. But if we want to go outside, for example, the Afghan area of operations, what got the United States involved in Somalia back in 1991, 1992? It was the images of atrocities of starving children and so forth. Television images can be a tremendously powerful thing to motivate and to change the American political debate. And unlike the early 1990s, today everyone carries a cell phone. Everyone can make that streaming video. And so these videos can go viral. And the fact of the matter is, whatever commitments the Taliban have made have been false. The United States fools itself into looking at diplomacy as a way to win peace. The Taliban and Pakistan look at diplomacy as an asymmetric warfare strategy in order to tie their opponent's hands while they can take unilateral actions. That's what we're facing, and ultimately that's going to be what creates the tipping point.
Well, one person who would always call a spade is the Afghan first Vice President Amarullah Saleh and his tweets over the years, even before he had picked out with President Ghani as well. But what do you see in terms of the Afghan situation? I mean, when you're talking about naming Pakistan as a state sponsor of terror, is that more symbolic, or sanctions that come with it, do they really hurt?
They certainly hurt, especially given an economy like Pakistan's, which is tremendously weak and tremendously corrupt and so forth. And on top of which, Pakistan might also face blowback and instability, because if the Americans aren't there, there's nothing to stop the Afghans and Pashtun nationalists from also engaging in terrorism inside Pakistan itself. But I really respect Amrullah Saleh. I first met him in Tajikistan when we both lived there in 1997. He definitely does call a spade a spade. The problem is the U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad tends to call a spade a rose garden or a bulldozer. I mean, exaggerates tremendously and doesn't seem as grounded in reality as Amrullah Saleh is.
Just going to take some of the questions that or comments that our viewers have put up. Dr. Rubin is Dagmara Musielska says, why is Pakistan still a non-NATO ally of the US? Do you see that changing?
Ultimately, I do see that changing. They became a major non-NATO ally in the wake of the September 11th attacks. When I was working on my book about a history of American diplomacy with rogue regimes and terrorist groups, I did a lot of research in Islamabad. I counted Pakistan actually as a rogue regime by the Clinton administration definition, because the ISI basically is a government unto itself. And I was told by a former head of the ISI that the biggest mistake that Pakistan made was deciding that they would be with the United States in the war on terror, that they should have extracted everything they needed from the United States in just hard, unrefined blackmail. And the fact of the matter is, once this shines through, I suggest that the mood in Congress would lead the United States to revoke this major NATO, non-NATO ally designation.
A very broad question that has been asked by Shaidesh. How will America's departure from Afghanistan work out for India and Pakistan? If I can take one more, because you were talking about sanctions and how they could hit. If you could explain to us, the Treasury Department sanctions and the State Department sanctions, and take this question as well from Amir V. After the US leaves, could one of those sticks actually be retaining precision drone strike capability in Pakistan and Afghanistan? Do they have that capacity in the region?
Well, certainly it's going to hurt our capacity. And this is one of the things which the Biden administration hasn't fully explained with regard to the decision. Intelligence is often derived from being on the ground. That said, we have LHDs, basically amphibious ready groups, which could be in the northern Indian Ocean. These are small aircraft carriers, which increasingly carry this sort of drones. But if you don't have the ability to know where the Taliban are at that moment, or Al-Qaeda and so forth, it makes it a little bit harder to address this. But certainly when push has come to shove, we have gone and crossed into Pakistan to make these strikes. But it should be noted, you mentioned before that President Biden was in the room when just over 10 years ago, the United States had that operation to kill Osama bin Laden. Remember that President Biden, at the time vice president, actually opposed that strike in the run-up to it in the internal discussion. So I'm not sure whether Biden will be as willing to pull the trigger as perhaps some of his successors will be. With regard to the other question about what this means for India and Pakistan, ultimately, India is a major power. It's a democracy. India is going to decide for itself what it's going to do in this region, and everyone will pay attention to what India decides because it is a major player. Pakistan may not understand just how dangerous this is. They will be triumphalist in the meantime. But every time a country has supported Islamist radicals for the sake of advancing their foreign policy, there has been blowback. We've seen it with Saudi Arabia. We've seen it with Syria. We've seen it with Turkey, and we're going to see it with Pakistan. And they fully don't understand how much of a problem this will be. I would actually argue that the wild card is Russia. Russia has tried to have it both ways. They've wanted to bloody the United States. They didn't want the United States to be successful, where in the past the Russians had failed. But now they're worried that they're going to have the Taliban and some of the groups associated with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups on their borders, going into what they see as their near abroad in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and so forth. And so I would expect the Russians to get much more active.
So by the same logic, why does China not worry so much, especially because of Xinjiang?
China should worry, but at this point, this is a question to ask Imran Khan. Why is it you talk about Islamophobia? Why is it you talk about defending the sanctity of Islam and so forth, and you subordinate yourself to be a little poodle to President to Xi in China? I mean, what is going on in Xinjiang with regard to the Uyghurs is nothing short of a Holocaust. It is ethnic cleansing. It is genocide, the forced rape of women, sterilization, and so forth. Pakistan is being humiliated by China on a daily basis. And maybe some realists in Pakistan want to say, hey, look, we're making money from CPEC. But the fact of the matter is, they're not. CPEC has been a disaster for Pakistan. They've sold out their sovereignty and they've gotten nothing in return.
Right. One of our viewers, Desi, is thanking you for your earlier answer, but I think you've answered another one of our regular viewers, Matara, who said, how will China deal with the exit?
Well, China is going to consolidate. I mean, whether Pakistan realizes or not, Pakistan is going to be forced further into China's sphere. And China may protect Pakistan when it comes to the FATF, but one of the reasons why unilateral sanctions work, even though traditionally countries, for example, like India, haven't agreed with American unilateral sanctions on Iran, is because corporations don't answer to their diplomats, they answer to their shareholders, and they're afraid of risk. And so while FATF might not work because China is going to eviscerate its spirit, the fact of the matter is the Western world and the democratic world can impose unilateral sanctions on Pakistan, which will be quite effective. When it comes to Afghanistan itself, China isn't going to have the benefits that perhaps they expect. They tried to get commodities in Afghanistan before through bribery, copper mines, and so forth. They weren't successful then. I doubt they're going to be more successful now.
Right. That just leads into what Ammevi says. China is looking at lithium and other minerals. Mesainak is what you were referring to, the copper mine there.
Yes.
Does Pakistan care if they are actually named a state sponsor of terror, and if there are sanctions that the US imposes on them to change its behavior?
I would say yes, and the metric I'm using to form that opinion is just the sheer number, the sheer amount of money which they are now spending in Washington to try to repair their reputation. But as the expression goes, at least in the United States, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig.
We're just playing out some of India's responses at multilateral fora, including the United Nations. And the question from Saurabh Sinha is, from the last decade, Pakistan is trying to prove that every terror attack in Balochistan is linked to India. What's the US's take on it? What's the official position, and do you have a view on it, Dr. Rubin?
Well, I mean, the United States didn't support groups like Jundallah, and this was something that came that the Iranians often suggested. But sometimes Pakistan would not be a state on the brink of failure if they would accept accountability for their own actions, if they would have fundamental reform, if they would realize that the more the Punjabis try to dominate the Pashtun, dominate the Baluchis, dominate the Sindhis, and so forth, the worse Pakistan is going to be off. Pakistan likes to envision itself as a state for the Muslims. In reality, it's a Punjabi chauvinist state. And this is what's driving a lot of the domestic problems inside Pakistan. This is why they lost half their country back in 1971 when Bangladesh decided enough with the discrimination that they wanted to be free.
When you talk about how the US will down the road look at Pakistan, what about the FATF? What about other major players in terms of terror sourcing?
Well, FATF can be a valuable tool, but the problem with international institutions is they're only a valuable tool so long as the countries who are members uphold the spirit of the agreement rather than the real politique of whatever their administration's position is at any point in time. This is why, for example, that the United Nations Human Rights Council hasn't been as effective as it could be. If China insists on defending Pakistan at the FATF and taking a subjective view rather than an objective view, then ultimately FATF isn't going to be as effective as it could be, which is why in a situation like that, rather than simply allow Pakistan quite literally to get away with murder, the United States, or at least a future administration, would be much more likely to sanction. And remember, even if the Biden administration, even if the State Department doesn't want to sanction, in the past, people like Undersecretary David Hale, who had been in Pakistan before, had perhaps carried water unofficially for Pakistan within State Department debates. Congress can intercede, and frankly, the Indian government is much more popular inside Congress than the Pakistanis are, and we have a growing generation of Indian American lawmakers, up to and including, frankly, the Vice President of the United States. That just shows the muscle of the Indian American community in the United States. They might not all agree on every single issue, but the fact of the matter is the trajectory is poor for Pakistan in the long run.
Hi to your cat there, who is also on
I
air right now. Not at all. I mean, lovely to see.
He's actually neo-conservative. He's my armchair warrior.
Oh, wow. Good to see. Dr. Rubin, again, when you're talking about, I beg your pardon, the US and Pakistan, I just wanted to, again, question you on how do you see the Taliban functioning? Is the Taliban completely under Rawalpindi, GHQ, the ISI as a hand, or like some analysts say, once it sees some kind of movement into power structure in Afghanistan, it can show its autonomy from Pakistan? How do you see it?
It will not show its autonomy from Pakistan. First of all, there's a couple things with the Taliban. In the 1990s, between 1995 and the year 2000, the United States negotiated with the Taliban on more than 36 occasions, including at a ministerial level when Bill Richardson met with the Taliban foreign minister. And what we found is that the Taliban simply lied. They lied about closing terror training camps. They lied about quarantining Osama bin Laden. One thing Zalmay Khalilzad has not been able to show is why the Taliban are any more nationalistic today or any different than they were 20 years ago. I mean, the definition of insanity is oftentimes, the quip goes, it's doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results each time. By that definition, Zalmay Khalilzad's policy is nothing short of insane. The fact of the matter is, on top of this, if we just look realistically at what the Taliban are promising and saying, they're promising in the February 29th agreement, for example, that they will disassociate themselves from Al-Qaeda. But when it comes to Al-Qaeda, remember, you're not just disassociating one group, the Taliban, from Al-Qaeda. You're literally demanding that brother disassociate from brother, that cousin disassociate from cousin, and that's not the way rural Afghan society works. That said, the reason why the Taliban will be dependent on Pakistan is the Taliban remain highly unpopular inside Afghanistan. If they were popular, if this notion of an Islamic emirate was popular, they wouldn't hesitate to go into elections, but they know if they did, they would get less than 2% of the vote. This is why they want to have a solution imposed on them. The only thing I regret, and this is why they're going to be dependent on Pakistan, the only thing I regret is if for purely domestic reasons, the United States insists on withdrawing, then we should have just withdrawn. What Zalmay Khalilzad did was essentially kneecap the Afghan government on the way out, and that is unconscionable.
Kneecap, and the Afghan government was never involved as well. When you talk about Al-Qaeda, it's Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and so many other groups. I think there are 22 proscribed groups, even by the UN, in the Afghan region. Iran, which is a state sponsor of terror according to US law, though of course the Biden administration is trying to engage with it. What do you see Iran's role, especially since we've seen the Taliban leaders, even when it was the previous leader Farouk, he was apparently traveling from Iran to Balochistan when he was killed. Okay,
well, first of all, where I think the Biden administration and might be a little bit softer than previous administrations is I suspect the Biden administration will not oppose and will actually encourage developments in Chabahar, and that's something which the Indian government has long asked the United States to do. But more broadly, what is Iran going to do? I mean, ultimately, I see a return to the 1990s. When I first went to Afghanistan in 1997, I was up in Mazar-e-Sharif, which was under Abdul Rashid Dostam's control. He was an ethnic Uzbek warlord. In Farah, Nimruz, and Herat, I expect that the Iranians are going to have set up their proxies along the border. And so while we might not go back immediately into active fighting that we saw towards the middle and the end of the 1990s, I suspect that all the neighboring states of Afghanistan are going to set up their ethnic militias simply to act as buffers to protect themselves. And Iran, of course, is very well situated to do this.
And is referring to what you were talking about there, Dr. Rubin. Will Iran, Pakistan, Russia trilaterally step into the empty shoes of the US in Afghanistan and redefine geopolitics in the region?
Officially, I don't think the answer is yes. Unofficially, there will probably be some understandings. But remember, back in these understandings existed before, and I traveled in Afghanistan at the time. That said, in 1996, what a lot of people, well, let me step back. America's historical memory, for us, ancient history is 10 years ago. We have a nationwide case of historical amnesia, but what a lot of people forget is back in 1996, when the Taliban entered Kabul, it was against the backdrop of UN brokered talks in order to have a broad-based Afghan government. Again, the United States looks at diplomacy as how to make peace, how to get to yes, how to have a win-win situation. The Taliban have a record of looking at diplomacy, and frankly, the ISI as well, as an asymmetric warfare strategy, and that's not going to change. That said, Russia understands the stakes, Iran understands the stakes, and they're not going to play around.
We're seeing some of that Taliban propaganda video of their training camps. Now, currently, it's North Korea, it's Iran, which is on the state sponsor of terror list. Cuba hasn't been taken off. Cuba hasn't been taken off. But
Cuba will be taken off.
Yes, but, I think January when the Trump administration, just before leaving, Secretary Pompeo put them on. But you are actually saying that it's not a theoretical possibility. It's a great likelihood that Pakistan will see itself designated as a state sponsor of terror in a while?
I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past, and my friends would say I only get that right 50% of the time. So I'm not going to make a prediction. What I would say is it's an arrow in our quiver of policy options, which now becomes much more possible. That said, when we talk about state-designated terror, traditionally, that was just the State Department. But the State Department, because of diplomatic concerns, oftentimes makes various compromises. In the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, by executive order, President George W. Bush enabled the Treasury Department to also make designations. And if you look online at the Treasury Department's list, which tend to be much more objective than subjective, they tend to be much more extensive. I would expect the Treasury Department to step up to the plate first, but ultimately, as Pakistan's reputation falls further in the United States, as they lose Congress, I suspect it's a matter of time until this consideration becomes a real possibility with regard to a formal State Department designation of terror.
Dr. Rubin, some of our viewers are complimenting you, and I'm going to put those on the screen. Harsh Behre, who says, excellent session. Shai Desai agrees. There are some other questions. There's something about your cat. I'm sorry, I didn't get the name. Your cat's name.
Oh, neo-catservative.
Okay, so there's a comment for a conservative from Matara who says Dr. Rubin's cat likes the show. And there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek one from Ame who says the cat doesn't like cats, but we leave that for another time, that discussion on that. Dr. Rubin, absolute pleasure having you on Strat News. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Just a reminder for our viewers, if you like videos like this one, just click on the bell icon on our YouTube channel. You will get notifications for when we put up either live videos or we premiere videos like this one. Do also go on our website, Strat News Global, to help support our kind of journalism if you do like it, and follow our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest news and analysis of strategic affairs, foreign policy, and defense analysis on Strat News Global. This is The Gist, and I'm Amit Abre.